While many eyes around the world were trained on Iran and Israel, another major shift in the global security environment was playing out a continent away, as NATO leaders gathered in the Netherlands to take photos, give quotes to the press, and to confront one of the alliance's oldest, most consistent and powerful opponents, consensus decision-making. It ultimately took the 2022 Russian invasion and years of diplomatic and political pressure to finally get the breadth of alliance members to the stage where they were hitting the old 2% of GDP spending target. But as the leaders gathered, some, especially Washington, were exerting pressure to push for a new target, proposing more than doubling the target from 2 to 5%. It was a massive figure, harkening back to Cold War-era spending levels that wasn't exactly without its critics or detractors. But in the end, despite all the voices to the contrary, we saw an agreement. Although, in line with the timeless traditions of coalition politics, it appears to have taken more than a few asterisks, side deals and definitional games in order to get everyone over the line. And so today, I'm going to try and unpack the new NATO agreement and the implications of that spending level, starting this episode mostly with the political and strategic aspects. So where the 5% defence spending target came from, who supported it, who opposed it, and what was finally agreed at the summit. That includes looking at the way that 5% spending target is split up between 3.5% on core or normal defence spending and 1.5% on some interesting extra items, with a particular focus on something that doesn't get talked about much, military mobility. Because unless you expect the Russians to pull off one heck of an amphibious flanking manoeuvre, building up armoured units in Spain, for example, wouldn't help you much if you couldn't transport them where they were needed in a crisis. Finally, we'll pivot to looking at some of the big picture implications, what this might mean for Europe, the United States, for Russia, and hopefully set the stage for a further discussion in the future. What it takes to get a rearmament effort like this one right, and the long, long list of ways to potentially get it wrong. Before we jump into it though, let me welcome back a sponsor. Odoo is an all-in-one family of management software covering a range of applications. In the past, I showed you how you might set up an e-commerce store, and today we're going to build on that with their CRM application. So what kind of things does that allow you to do? Firstly, it allows you to instantly capture leads. Customer emails and inquiries can automatically be converted into opportunities, which become cards with the essential information. Think priority, potential revenue, etc. The Kanban view organises those opportunities by stage, which you can customise accordingly, and moving them between stages is a simple drag and drop exercise. Communication is streamlined. Within each task you have the chatter. You can send emails, you can log notes, save your own email templates, or schedule your next calls and meetings. Everything here is centralised to help make management as simple as possible. You can also send quotes with just a few clicks directly from the opportunity. The customer's data will be pre-filled, so just add your product and prices, preview the result if you want, and then it's just a matter of sending it to your customer for signature. Just like that, you might have made your first sale. And that functionality is backed up by analysis and forecasting functions, complete with personalised dashboards. And perhaps the best part of all, your first piece of Odoo software, whether it be this or any other application, is free for life, with unlimited hosting and support. So if you're interested, please do check out today's sponsor Odoo. You'll find the link in the description. Before we get to the recent NATO summit, a little bit of background around this 5% demand. As you may have noticed over the course of the year, there have been a couple of political fissure points, if you like, between the United States and the rest of the NATO allies. The list of illustrations of that isn't exactly a short one. Tariffs and the trade war, discussion about potentially annexing Greenland, the split on Ukraine policy, the temporary pause on some US weapons shipments to Kyiv, clashes over business, technology and market regulation, especially of US international firms, and then to top off that not at all exhaustive list was the question of allied defence spending. At the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth said the United States could no longer be primarily focused on European security, that it would remain committed to NATO Article 5 and the Common Defence, but the implication was that the expectation going forward would be that the European allies in particular would carry more of the financial burden for the defence of their continent. What we eventually saw Washington do was actually attach a number to that concept of broader burden sharing in defence, an increase in the NATO spending target from 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP, which would have lifted the spending target considerably above the current US defence spending level and set it to something more akin to a détente-era Cold War level. As I originally said on the channel, around the time this 5% number first started to be floated, there were a lot of reasons to suspect that it wouldn't happen. Firstly, the question of political will. NATO spending targets require unanimity to put into place, and some nations, Spain is a very clear example, had publicly opposed that goal. The second reason was that if Russia was the primary identified security threat in the European theatre, going to 5% would arguably represent monstrous overkill, even before the Russian military started its large-scale adoption of the assault ladder. To me, a 5% figure then would be more consistent with a more ambitious goal. either a NATO that took on a greater role in the Asia-Pacific, for example, or to have a world where the European wing of NATO was able to confidently deter Russia and other potential security threats almost independently of any US military commitment. It's very true that Moscow has long spent a higher percentage of GDP on defence, and that was true even before the invasion of Ukraine, that the country enjoys certain purchasing power parity advantages, and that since February 2022, Russian defence spending in percentage of GDP terms has absolutely skyrocketed. From a strategic balance perspective, you could argue that absolutely merited an Allied response. But it is very much possible, I'd argue, to overstate the case. Headlines like this one, for example, saying, quote, Russian defence spending overtakes Europe, study finds, relied on a little bit of one-sided mathematics. It took one estimate of forecast Russian defence expenditure in 2024, about 13.1 trillion rubles or 146 billion US dollars, and compared that to a European defence expenditure of around 457 billion. It then took a purchasing power parity multiplier, because many military resources are cheaper in Russia than they are in Europe or the United States, and then estimated that in terms of bang for their buck, Russia would get about as much value from their 147 billion as the United States would from 461. Seeing as 461 is a larger number than 457, you get the headline. The issue, of course, is that's a comparison of purchasing power parity on one side with nominal values on the other. Sure, stuff tends to be cheaper in Chelyabinsk than it does in LA, but there are also plenty of places in Eastern and Southern Europe in particular where you're not exactly going to be paying Manhattan prices. Apply purchasing power parity to both sides then, and you'll come up with an estimate something like this one, showing that in 2024, the non-US NATO allies still had a significant spending advantage over Russia. That obviously doesn't capture other factors like Russia's hidden expenditure or the composition of that spending, but it helps put things into perspective when you try and understand what a jump to 5% would mean. When you're looking at a chart like this one, showing that the jump to 5% would, even in purchasing power parity terms, put the non-US NATO allies in Ukraine at a level where they were comfortably out effectively spending the Russian Federation 4-1, you can see why some may have argued that a spending level that might have been sufficient to deter the Soviets might be overkill in the world where the deterrence concern was the Russian Federation, and a bunch of the old red team had enthusiastically switched sides since 1991. Even if that level of spending had been deemed necessary, there were open questions as to whether or not the defence sector in Europe and the United States would actually be capable of absorbing it. There are only so many shipyards, so many factories, so many suppliers that are accredited to work on defence projects. And so even if the money were put on the table, it's not entirely clear the capacity to deliver product in exchange for that funding would be available potentially for years. However, there was at least one strong countervailing argument in favour of the 5% figure. Washington said they wanted it, and so as NATO leaders gathered for their June conference, the 5% figure went on the table. In the lead-up to the NATO summit, we did hear potential spoiler language from a number of participants. There was opposition to the increased 5% target from Spain, while President Trump suggested in public the US shouldn't have to abide by the same defence spending standards as the rest of NATO, given, he argued, that the US had been carrying an inordinate share of the defence burden for years. How then did we end up with an alliance-wide target at a level that some had publicly opposed that did cover the United States? Part of the answer, I'd argue, is in the detail. The news that came out was that the alliance was going to set a 5% target, sort of, with a few deals being struck in order to get everyone over the line. Spain, for example, which was very publicly on the outer during several of these discussions and came under threats of enhanced tariffs from President Trump for its opposition to the increased target, sought to opt out of the new figure, and sort of succeeded in doing so with a major asterisk. Ultimately, NATO's defence spending targets are meant to just be a means to an end. You don't deter Russian military action by building a giant wall of euros and setting it fire the moment a T-72 rolls into view. You do it by converting those euros, those dollars, those pounds, those krona into military capability. Regarding those capabilities, NATO has targets for all of its member states. Unlike the spending targets, those are not publicly disclosed in detail. We've covered some of what we believe about those capability targets in the past and the significant jump they represent in the resources that would be available to the alliance to meet a military contingency if needed. Spain did not get an exception from hitting those capability targets. Instead, the claim of the Spanish government is they believe they can reach those capability targets while spending considerably less than 5% of GDP. The response from NATO, as you can see with that letter on the right there, basically boiled down to, you're welcome to try. Spain will have to submit its own annual spending plans to NATO and convince the alliance on an ongoing basis how it's going to reach those targets without spending more. Then in 2029, all of this will be reviewed, suggesting that potentially, if Spain isn't managing to pull off any budgetary magic at that point, the pressure is going to grow for them to build capability the old-fashioned way, by paying for it. And that 2029 review of spending and capability trends isn't just a Spain thing, it's alliance-wide, meaning we should expect to see an in-depth review of the trajectory of spending and capability building under this plan and an assessment of whether or not it's working as intended relatively soon after the end of the current US administration. Speaking of the United States, this 5% spending target does bind them. However, once again, there's an asterisk. Arguably that 5% isn't really 5%. It's the sum of two different spending commitments, 3.5% on core defence and 1.5% on what I'm going to call soft defence. The 3.5% figure for core defence is essentially defence spending as NATO already defines it, so jumping that 2% target up to 3.5%. And since that 3.5% figure happens to be very close to the 3.4% the United States currently spends, Washington isn't going to have to reach particularly far in order to have to hit the new number. The additional 1.5% can come from a wide array of categories, including, quote, protecting our critical infrastructure, defending our networks, ensuring our civil preparedness and resilience, unleashing innovation, and strengthening our defence industrial base, end quote. We'll dig a little bit more into this category later in the video, but that essentially, in a budgetary sense, it allows NATO members to take a lot of expenditure that might, yes, have some military value, but which wouldn't ordinarily be counted, and use it to make up part of that 5% figure. Okay, so if that's the broad strokes of what's been agreed, starting with that 3.5% core defence spending target, what does all of this actually mean? And in a moment, I'll put some very big numbers to it, but first, two significant caveats. Firstly, perhaps in part because the NATO members have an interest in not hitting their defence industry with an inflationary bunker buster, the 5% goal isn't instant. As with the original 2% goal, countries have a number of years to make it to 3.5%, specifically 2035. Given the number of years it feels like we've experienced in 2025 to date, suffice to say that 2035 is a long way away. And with a major review window scheduled for 2029, it's possible for all of this to change before it's fully implemented. If Putin hits his head or something and undergoes a 180-degree personality change, deciding he doesn't want to be in the territorial expansion game anymore and instead wants to, join the European Union, then we'd probably expect to see that 3.5% figure revised downwards. If by contrast the Russians start storming through the Suwalki Gap or aliens start landing on the Dalmatian coast, maybe we'll see an upward revision. Either way, for the moment, NATO members, if they choose to, have considerable scope to kick the can down the road, so to speak. And despite this agreement, when or if we'll see significant increases remains to be seen. That leads very directly to point 2, that it's possible for there to be a disconnect between what nations agree to and what they eventually do. Many NATO states, for example, agreed to the 2% spending goal and then proceeded to not spend 2%. So you can expect that within NATO, in the coming weeks and months, there'll be a lot of diplomatic and political follow-up to try and turn the scope of this agreement into actual budgetary outcomes. Assuming most members eventually hit that 3.5% target though, how much money are we talking? To work that out, I put in place a couple of grounding assumptions, which hopefully are on the side of being conservative. And the main comparison figure I'm going to focus on is the difference between what alliance defence spending on that core 3.5% category would be in 2035, assuming all members hit it, compared to what it would be if they all continue to spend the same percentage of GDP they currently do. We're going to assume that the NATO economies grow at a rate of about 1.5% per annum between 2024 and 2035, that those growth rates are spread evenly across nations of all military purchasing power levels, which they're not, and also that MPPP multipliers are going to remain the same over time, which, again, they shouldn't. We'll also assume that countries won't try and take advantage of MPP differences. If you're Denmark, for example, where defence spending doesn't tend to go as far as in many other jurisdictions, we're going to assume that Copenhagen spends all that kroner in Denmark anyway, rather than, purchasing some of its drones from Ukraine, where the multiplier is much, much higher, and thus getting a much greater overall return on the investment. Caveats in place, let's look at some numbers. The chart you can see on screen here shows NATO defence spending in nominal US dollar terms. The blue bar for the USA and non-US NATO allies represents 2024 defence spending estimates as they currently stand. The non-US states at around $500 billion and the US rapidly approaching $1 trillion. The orange segment then accounts for the impact of economic growth between 2024 and 2035 on current spending levels. In other words, if current spending as a percentage of GDP stays the same, we'd see non-US NATO spending increase to about $600 billion in US dollar terms by 2035, while the US would then be significantly north of $1.1 trillion. The big green bar, though, reflects the impact of that 3.5% target. Given the US is already spending roughly 3.4%, it would only need a minor increase to get to 3.5 by 2035. In our very basic model, that's enough to get it to almost $1.2 trillion. The effect on the non-US NATO allies is much more pronounced. They jump from about $600 billion to more than $1 trillion, significantly slicing down the gap between what the US spends and what the rest of the alliance spends. And in fact, if you factor in purchasing power parity, you get this chart here, suggesting that in felt terms, so how large a force, how much equipment you can purchase with a given amount of budget, it would actually feel by 2035 like the rest of NATO was spending more on defence than the US was, with combined allied spending in purchasing power parity terms exceeding $2.5 trillion. Now, I don't know about you, but at least on paper that looks like the kind of scenario where the non-US NATO allies would have more than enough financial firepower to counterbalance the Russians. In that scenario, we just looked at the impact of that 3.5% target across the non-US members is about $440 billion per year, which, even by the standards of NATO equipment pricing, is the kind of sum that can buy you a lot of stuff. Very roughly, for example, $440 billion would buy you about 80 Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers at $5.5 billion per unit, or 2,900 fighter aircraft at about $150 million each, 200,000 Meteor air-to-air missiles at about $2.2 million per unit, about 4 million reasonably fancy one-way attack drones or mini air-launched cruise missiles at roughly $100,000 per shot, or a casual 440 million FPV drones, assuming you can find a model you like for about $1,000 a unit. Even if you tripled that unit price or cut the budget by 2/3, you'd still be buying more drones per year than Russia has people. Now, obviously, budget increases aren't going to go just to procurement, and the euros and pounds that do make it to that category have to be spread across everything the military needs, not just buying enough drones to be able to cause a localised eclipse. But the core point is that even without going to 5%, the European and allied economies are just so large that even the comparatively smaller target increase would generate a truly mind-bending amount of additional funding. But as in almost every case, just comparing numbers on a spreadsheet probably isn't going to capture the entire dynamic of the balance between two groups. The NATO allies, for example, will always suffer from the danger of being less than the sum of their parts, due to all the duplication, the inefficiencies, the lack of standardisation or coordination difficulties that come with taking lots of smaller forces and trying to bolt them together into a single cohesive one. For better or worse, while the Russian military is occasionally a very Russian military, it is a Russian military. NATO's military power, by contrast, is much more composite. At the same time, though, there are factors that balance in the other direction. Unlike Russia, the NATO allies aren't currently fighting an active war. When they obtain new equipment or recruit new personnel, there's a chance they actually get to keep and accumulate them. Supporting Ukraine costs the alliance members a considerably smaller share of their available resources than sustaining their war effort does for Russia. And because Russia's military demands are immediate, its spending priorities need to be as well. Signing bonuses to attract 40 or 50-year-olds into the assault infantry or refurbished T-62s are not long-term investments in Russian military power. Which I think segues well into another detail about this new NATO agreement that I think was lost in a lot of the headlines about the new 5% number, the way it describes Russia and the way it approaches Ukraine. Symbolically, I imagine a number of members are quite happy that they were able to get unanimous agreement on language describing Russia as a threat to Euro-Atlantic security. But more importantly, the declaration, the agreement if you like, that followed the Hague summit included the following language, quote, "Allies reaffirmed their enduring sovereign commitments to provide support to Ukraine, whose security contributes to ours. And, to this end, we will include direct contributions towards Ukraine's defence and its defence industry when calculating Allies' defence spending." End quote. Essentially, the new agreement gives nations two main options for dialling up their defence spending, either investing in their own and NATO militaries, or supporting the Ukrainian one. And it's interesting that the way that inclusion is framed isn't in moralistic terms, that Ukraine has a right to self-defence and should be supported, for example, but rather with the argument that investing in Ukrainian security is a way of investing in NATO security, which I'd argue from a cold economic perspective makes a certain degree of sense. NATO can attempt to maintain deterrence with Russia by counterbalancing Russian military forces with their own, or they can provide Ukraine what they need, not only to defend their country, but also to grind down Russia's military potential. Compare the costs of generating and sustaining a German armour brigade with what it costs the Ukrainians to delete a Russian one, and you might start to see the potential strategic ROI here from a NATO perspective. I think there's a chance that over the last several years, many of us have gotten desensitised to the sheer rate of materiel consumption in Ukraine, especially from a Russian perspective. But even as loss rates in some equipment categories have fallen off, presumably in part as availability becomes more of an issue, the overall picture is still very much too great to ignore. In June, for example, the Russian VKS arguably had its worst month of the war, with the core point here being that even if Russian industry has succeeded in increasing production of some munitions and systems, as long as those systems are being actively consumed in Ukraine, they can't be stocked up, if you like, to shift the balance with NATO. A good way to illustrate this mathematically might be with something like the long-range drone threat. If Russia was able to sustainably produce 200 long-range one-way attack drones in the Shahed style per day, roughly 75,000 per year, by the middle of 2027, it might have 150,000 of the things available to use in a potential saturation attack that at the moment, I'd argue NATO's air defence system isn't exactly optimised to counter. Even a 99% intercept rate in that scenario, which seems ambitious, would still translate to something like 1,500 hits. If those drones are being salvoed off against Ukraine on an almost daily basis, however, there's no time for that stockpile and thus that threat to accumulate. And so one of the most economical ways for NATO to balance off that potential Russian drone threat might be to help give Ukraine the systems it needs to hit the production facilities for those drones where it can, and where that's not possible, give them what they need to neutralise the things before they hit their targets. From a strategic perspective, there's also the element of buying time. Because while we've seen plenty of claims in the media that Russia might be considering an operation against one or more NATO states in insert number of years here, it seems deeply unlikely they'd attempt that as long as they're still struggling through the Donbass. By NATO standards, Ukraine fields a very large military. If they were in the alliance, they'd actually have the second largest force after the United States. And as long as that force exists and is capable of and willing to fight, Russia's ability to threaten NATO states during this rebuilding phase, if you like, is obviously going to be tightly limited. This is part of the reason why I'd argue that even if you left aside humanitarian and political concerns for a moment, just through the lens of cold, hard defence economics logic, military assistance to Ukraine has probably offered the NATO allies an incredible rate of return since February 2022. Ukraine has consumed the overwhelming bulk of Russia's military resources. It's burned through irreplaceable equipment stockpiles, stressed the economy, and inflicted hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of casualties. And yet you could easily pay for all the aid that's been allocated to Ukraine across all of the NATO countries, with well less than 1 year's worth of the additional spending that 3.5% target calls for. The estimated $65 billion worth of military assistance from the United States, as estimated by the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, would consume less than 2 months of the additional funding that 3.5% target calls for in the non-US NATO members. Compare that to the results they've achieved and the amount of damage they've managed to inflict on Russian military potential with that assistance, and you can probably see why some alliance members might have pushed so hard for this particular inclusion, and the strategic logic that saw it included in the final declaration. Whether or not nations now choose to take greater advantage of that provision, rather than spending their limited available resources building up often more expensive domestic military capabilities that they would hope to never have to use, only time will tell. But all of that analysis really focuses on that 3.5% core defence spending target. The weapon systems, the personnel, the bases, the munitions, the things that the alliance has previously counted when it considered defence spending. But what about that 1.5% in soft defence spending? Because I've seen this described as everything from fake or nothing defence expenditure intended to make the overall number look bigger than it actually is, through to potentially being some of the most important investments in the alliance's overall capabilities. And you know what? The difference there probably matters because, to use the 2024 GDP numbers, if you're spending 1.5% of this alliance on that kind of stuff, it spits out a number north of $800 billion per annum, which even by government standards would be a lot of money to potentially be spent on nothing. The agreement at the summit set out a number of things that this money could be spent on while still counting towards that overall 5% target, and I want to focus on just a few of them. Starting with what I'd potentially argue is one of the strategic elephants in the room, military mobility. In a lot of strategic scenarios, having all the military assets in the world might not help you if you don't have the capacity to get them to where they're needed. And while the NATO alliance invested very heavily during the Cold War era to make sure that its forces could come together rapidly in a crisis, a number of things have changed since 1991. For one, the alliance has gained many new members, many former potential enemies are now allies, and with some of those additions, like Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland, the potential battlefields in the event of an escalation scenario with Russia have moved significantly further east. That might potentially sound very promising from an allied perspective, because now the blue team has a lot more assets on its side. But for a long time, NATO's planning, transport, and logistics model was built around a very different idea. The big battlefields were meant to be places like central Germany. The core logistics challenges then would be getting American reinforcements across from the continental United States, and then getting them to the front with their equipment. It seems rather likely to me, however, that many of the new alliance members would probably prefer alliance plans don't involve stopping the Russians only once they get to, Berlin. And some of their most feared scenarios might be ones where the Russians don't exactly go all out, where they try and grab some NATO territory, for example in the Baltic states, and then, having taken some objectives, start threatening the use of nuclear weapons and calling for negotiations that ultimately would leave them with more than they had when they started. To avoid that kind of threat to the eastern flank, NATO needs to be able to fight on the eastern flank. But a lot of the structures to do that just aren't there the way they once were for West Germany. You may not know this, for example, but NATO has an extensive pipeline system. Air forces and armoured units in particular can consume a shit ton of fuel. And once they're built, pipelines are one of the most efficient ways to get that fuel where it needs to be. By NATO figures, the pipeline system runs approximately 10,000 kilometres through 12 NATO countries, has a storage capacity of 4.1 million cubic metres, and links together storage depots, military air bases, civil airports, pumping stations, truck and rail loading stations, refineries, and various other entry and discharge points. And I've thrown up an image of some of the extensive infrastructure included in the multinational Central European pipe system on the right there. And as you can see, it pretty much stops before the borders of the old Federal Republic of Germany. There is, of course, other infrastructure and pipeline systems that could be used, but the point is the purpose-built military infrastructure wasn't built and hasn't generally been updated with defence of the eastern flank in mind. And beyond the infrastructure, just about everything else you can think of that would affect a transportation plan and its requirements has also changed with the times. As new members have joined NATO, where NATO's troops are likely to come from in a crisis has obviously changed. A lot of the equipment used has also changed, in some cases getting heavier and bulkier. One of the simplest ways to upgrade an armoured vehicle like a tank, for example, is just to stick more and more stuff in or on it. And between additional armour, more sensors, a larger gun, active protection systems and a range of other upgrades, a Leopard 2A7 is about 10 tonnes heavier than the old Leopard 2A4, and the M1A2 SEP V3 about 10 tonnes heavier than the old M1A1. A lot of that weight represents features that tank crews will probably appreciate once they're slugging it out on the front line, but it doesn't much help those who have to find bridges that can support the things. Some of the military infrastructure, especially that built since 1991, might not have been constructed with potential military use in mind. And some of the older stuff that was may no longer be good enough. Especially when you're talking about the former Warsaw Pact states, it might have been military mobility for a very different set of equipment. The Soviets may have intended for a bridge to be able to support a tank, for example, but there's all the difference in the world between a 45-ton T-90 and a German Big Cat or the American Abrams. The fact is, if you took a Russian BMP-3, drove it on top of a T-72, the resulting expedient battlefield creation would be in roughly the same weight category as some of those heavy Western MBTs. And even those challenges are still arguably just scratching the surface. A modern NATO transportation plan, for example, would have to factor in new threats to rear areas. Drone attacks and precision missile strikes, for example, are probably much more of a threat now than they were in 1985. And the old assumption that the alliance in a crisis could rely on the United States and its massive stock of strategic enablers like heavy airlift capacity or aerial refueling may not sit as comfortably with some of the allies now as it did in decades past. The NATO headquarters, with the humble task of figuring out how to jump through all of these logistical hoops, is the Joint Support and Enabling Command, JSEC. They were established in 2019 with a mission to ensure that NATO troops, when required, could move at the scale and speed necessary to deter adversaries and defend the alliance. At the heart of JSEC's work is the concept of the Reinforcement and Sustainment Network, the RSN. The RSN is a combination of physical infrastructure, ports, airfields, mobility corridors, that kind of thing, and then also a functional layer, the rules, the regulations, the contracts and the plans that make movement through that physical infrastructure possible. During peacetime, most of that infrastructure is owned or controlled by states or private companies. JSEC's job is to understand it and plan around things like choke points and vulnerabilities, but it doesn't ordinarily control it. Then in the event of a crisis, the idea is the RSN can be activated and start doing things like prioritising military movements rather than making sure that tourists make it to the Riviera on time. As an aside here, an interesting dynamic then is that the organisation that understands the European transportation network and is responsible for coordinating those logistics in a crisis sits within the NATO command structure. That means the European head of JSEC, currently a German Lieutenant General, ultimately reports through to Sakya, an American, which obviously has great benefits from an alliance coordination perspective, but does potentially raise some questions about how independently the Europeans might be able to organise and respond in the event of a crisis, in the event that Washington decided NATO should have nothing to do with it. The key point, though, is that JSEC and the European Union understand the alliance has some military mobility challenges. There's a lot of regulation and red tape that can get in the way of military movements, and also a lot of potential infrastructure bottlenecks. Indeed, if you ask some planners what the greater threat to the logistics system was, red tape or Russian sabotage, I'm not sure the vote would be 100% one way. Along just the major military mobility corridors, the European Union's Transportation Commissioner has identified around 500 military mobility hotspot projects. Everything from road and railway bridge repairs and reinforcement, tunnel widening, port infrastructure, rail infrastructure expansion, you name it. In April, we also heard about a European port strategy to make sure that the continent's harbours had the capacity necessary to manage logistical demands in time of war, all of which might go to increase the speed at which various members of the alliance can mobilise and reinforce each other. All of those things are examples of the kind of project that you might justify fitting within that 1.5% target. And if you're looking at this from a deterrence and a Russian perspective, that kind of thing might really matter. That's true both from a military perspective. It's hard to win quick and try and hold territory against an opponent that can rapidly reinforce itself, and also from a political perspective. If a country can't reasonably get its troops or equipment to the front, that might provide an excuse for them not to send them. But if the infrastructure is there, some of those excuses start to drop away. In its Defence White Paper, European Defence 2030, the European Commission already flagged military mobility as a primary capability gap. And so really you could argue that by including military mobility projects in the definition of at least part of that 5%, NATO is really just making provision to make sure that the European allies get credit for investments they were likely already planning to make. Huge amounts are being spent, for example, building up production capacity and reshoring supply chains. Germany's Rheinmetall, for example, is establishing multiple new facilities, and even Denmark has announced they're going to be restarting artillery ammunition production. The war in Ukraine has very clearly demonstrated just how much the industrial side of all this matters. And so in a sense, all NATO is really doing here is recognising that fact as well. The same could be said for building up supply chain resilience, stockpiling critical minerals, developing cyberspace defences against cyber attack, for example, and also developing critical technology areas, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. Because, again, as we've seen in Ukraine, often the line between military and civilian development can be a bit fuzzy. Image recognition technology developed for the civilian sector can have deadly battlefield applications, while history is full of developments intended originally for military use that go on to enter the civilian economy. The long story short here then is what you'd really want a spending target not to do is incentivise countries to cut back on really valuable kinds of spending from a defence perspective, just because the target is only concerned with very specific types of defence spending. Under the old model, for example, if a country decided to let its transportation infrastructure go to shit and gutted civilian research and development efforts that might eventually have military applications, but quadrupled salaries for its generals and admirals, the old system might assess that as a straight increase in defence spending, and the country would get a pat on the back from NATO. You obviously don't want nations entirely skipping out on their core defence spending, hence the decision to have two separate targets, but this kind of soft or supporting investment really does matter. It's also the kind of investment where you can often have significant crossover with goals for the wider civilian economy. If you need to overhaul, expand and modernise your rail transportation system, for example, then that might be a great opportunity to try and build military mobility concerns into your planning. And while things like new bridges, larger ports, or modernised rail might be really useful in the worst case scenario, those same assets might be really useful to the civilian sector the remaining 99.9% of the time. So then, does this 1.5% represent fake defence investment intended to make countries look like they're spending more than they are, or does it cover some critical investment areas that can have immense military value? At this stage, I think the only answer we can give here is yes. Because just like tax write-offs for a small business, it's really going to come down to what nations choose to claim and what NATO decides to let them get away with. If the money is actually spent on transportation infrastructure pain points, relevant research and development, industrial capacity, etc., then in the long run, it might actually deliver a greater military return on investment than some of the spending in the core category. While if nations start categorising footpath repairs at Lake Como as a NATO military mobility project, then the strategic impact of that 1.5% might not be quite so hard-hitting. As for which way it goes, only time will tell. So from a strategic perspective, what then does all this potentially mean for the various powers involved? While the takeaways might be complicated for some, I'd argue the Hague Declaration does have its clear winners and losers. In the winners column would be nations on NATO's eastern flank, or those that are already at or near the new target spending levels. Although note that since 2022, the Venn diagram of those two categories of NATO allies has pretty much become a circle. In 2024, Poland already exceeded the 3.5% target spending level. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Greece were all comparatively close. Many of those states had already announced plans for even further increases. And once you factor in their military assistance to Ukraine, these states probably won't have to stretch much in order to make the new targets. What they'll hope to get out of it, though, is many other allies following their spending lead and a much more militarily capable alliance overall. For the Eastern Flank states in particular, who've been especially nervous since February 2022, getting the US president to publicly reaffirm his commitment to Article 5 was probably a win, as is that 1.5% spending target for soft or defence-adjacent spending. Many NATO military mobility projects are likely to either be in their states or intended to help reinforcements and supplies get to their states more quickly. That potentially means both more security in a crisis and also potentially the benefits of greater connectivity during peacetime. So while there might be mixed feelings about this agreement in some other European capitals, once the respective delegations returned home, I imagine there might have been a toast or two in the likes of Warsaw or Tallinn. And meanwhile for Russia, this might not have been a worst-case outcome, but it was pretty bad. In economic terms, after years of fighting in Ukraine, we're seeing even figures like Vladimir Putin himself accept that the Russian economy is showing signs of strain. He recently acknowledged publicly that increased defence spending had driven inflation, and expressed a hope that defence spending in Russia would be able to start coming down from 2026. But if the Allies keep to this agreement, Russia might be faced with a difficult dilemma. Keep spending at essentially wartime levels in an attempt to try and keep up, or accept that with every year that passes, the spending discrepancy is likely to grow, and the military balance is likely to shift more and more against Moscow. And even then, that presumes that Russia will have the luxury of setting its defence expenditure primarily based on what NATO's doing, which for the moment it can't, because the war in Ukraine is very much a going concern, which is where issue 2, the military element, comes in. In the short term, NATO states being able to count military assistance to Ukraine towards their spending targets might encourage more of them to maintain or expand that assistance. Over the last year or two, for example, we've seen a greater and greater share of Allied military assistance take the form of direct aid to Ukraine's military industry, essentially funding Ukraine's efforts to build weapons, usually relatively cheaply for itself. In the context of an attritional war, that kind of model can be particularly painful for Russia, because it creates a way for the Allies to exploit one of their main advantages over Russia, their much larger economies in nominal euro and dollar terms, to produce military equipment at Ukrainian rather than German, Danish or American prices. And it's exactly that kind of model that the Hague Declaration explicitly includes in the new defence spending definition. And then, still with that Russian perspective, on the political side, things get even worse. One of the great hopes expressed by a number of Russian commentators going into 2025 was that the changeover in US administrations would lead to a breakdown within NATO. The US might potentially cast doubt on Article 5, reduce its commitments to Europe, meaning that even if Europe scaled up its military capacity in response, Russia might still have taken at least some solace from the US not being on the European Strategic Board in the same way. Instead, by essentially capitulating to the US demand for higher alliance spending, the Europeans appear to have managed to attract a recommitment to Article 5 from Washington DC, and left Moscow potentially dealing with the worst of both worlds. A Europe which is actively rearming, but is still connected by Article 5 to the United States. Now, of course, with the pace of strategic developments in 2025, all of this still might change. But for the moment, it looks awfully like Russia launched its February 2022 invasion saying it wanted to see less NATO, only for it to end up first with 2 new alliance members, now compounded by a 150% increase in the alliance spending target. For the 2 groups of nations that will actually be spending the bulk of this additional funding, however, the Europeans and to a lesser extent the United States, I'd argue trying to assess winners and losers here is much more nuanced and to a degree contingent, with a lot hinging not so much on what was agreed, but how it's ultimately implemented. And to illustrate what I mean, let's start with the non-US NATO allies, because it's there where these targets would create the greatest degree of spending change, and also where we still have, I think, the most unknowns. And when I say unknowns, I mean a really wide array of them, starting with the possibility that this doesn't really even happen at all. In some respects, that 2035 timeline was necessary, but it also provides a lot of scope for budgetary and political can-kicking. It is deeply unlikely, and in some cases constitutionally impossible, that the leaders who signed off on this 5% target will be the ones who stand accountable in 2035 for whether their country actually hits it or not. So while some countries have already made concrete steps towards scaling up defence spending, and indeed some NATO states may already be at the 5% target once you factor in soft spending as well, that's not a guarantee they'll all get there. The second issue is that even if it does, there's no guarantee that it'll be done efficiently, and we'll start to unpack some of the ways this spending could go wrong in the future, but one potential risk, just to flag up front, is that it becomes an alternative to reforms. That instead of implementing necessary changes to supply chains, procurement systems, military organisation, etc., money is simply used to paper over the cracks. One way that might happen is if additional funding is forthcoming, but it just turns into inflation rather than additional output. We saw this in 2022 and 2023, where there was a lot of money suddenly desperately chasing every 155mm shell on the market at exactly the time where there was a deep supply chain squeeze for a lot of the precursors and materials you need to make artillery shells. As one NATO senior military official at the time said, the price of a 155mm shell jumped from about €2,000 to €8,000 over the course of Russia's full-scale invasion. Something like that happening at the scale of one particular munition in a high-demand scenario is understandable but economically costly. If that phenomenon were to occur across the breadth of a rearmament effort of that scale, it could be economically damaging and militarily self-destructive. Hence the imperative to make sure that new investments are actually generating new production, economies of scale, and bringing costs down, not just becoming a case where you have more dollars or euros chasing the same amount of productive capacity, with manufacturers eventually deciding to prioritise the highest bidder as the various NATO states essentially cannibalise each other's budgets. It's also unclear the extent to which we'll see this funding being used to generate a truly European defence ecosystem and industry versus just protecting individual national components, preserving the lack of standardisation and the focus of various European defence firms on producing small amounts of equipment for individual buyers. I'd argue if you just look at the raw numbers from a defence economics perspective, you could argue there is enough there in Europe to have a defence industrial base that is broadly technologically, scale and cost competitive with, for example, the United States. It's also possible for countries like France, Germany and the United Kingdom to protect their relevant defence firms with enough protection and enough investment. What probably isn't possible is doing both. In some cases, the Allies are going to have to decide whether they want an efficient, competitive European defence sector or whether they want to prioritise protecting their national champions. Expressed another way, if push comes to shove, what do you ultimately prioritise? European strategic autonomy or a degree of national industrial sovereignty? Because if the answer is going to be both, you're probably going to see an impact on the bang-to-buck ratio. And the list of unknowns from a European perspective really does go on. How much of this increased spending will actually be available for investments in infrastructure, research and development or new equipment, as opposed to attracting and retaining the people necessary to, crew it? One disadvantage relatively wealthy economies with all volunteer forces have is that it can be very expensive to attract people into military service. And we've already seen that the German defence minister hasn't entirely ruled out the possibility of the country reinstating some kind of conscription system if the volunteer model isn't able to provide the personnel they need. Germany reportedly needs roughly 100,000 additional troops in the Bundeswehr in order to meet its NATO capability targets, but it remains to be seen just how much it would cost to attract 100,000 additional Germans into uniform. Ukraine's potential role is also a question mark, as is the industrial involvement of other allied non-US states, think Canada, the United Kingdom or Australia. But if you strip this back just to the basic economics, I think the argument is that if this does happen, how much it ultimately effectively costs and what it means for the allied economies will really come down to execution. To illustrate that, on the right there you can see some charts containing some very basic economic modelling. It assumes a scenario where EU states steadily ramp up defence spending on an overall basis by about 1.5% of GDP between now and 2028. And what immediately stands out is between the three different scenarios they looked at, just tinkering with how the money is allocated out of that 1.5% can have a significant impact on how much debt is accrued as a result of that spending, and also what the effect on real GDP is. In the main scenario, for example, only about 10% of that additional defence expenditure went into the kinds of defence spending that tend to have higher multiplier effects, that is, things that tend to have more knock-on benefits for the wider economy. Generally speaking, that tends to be things like research and development spending or transportation infrastructure. In that scenario, EU government debt is about 2 percentage points of GDP higher than it otherwise would be, but real GDP is about 0.5% higher. Buff those higher productivity investments like research and development and transportation up to 20% of the additional spend though, and suddenly, as you can see, for the same amount of spending, you get more GDP growth and less debt. On the flip side, if instead of buying European weapon systems, you bring in more of them from abroad, the higher import scenario, you end up, understandably, getting lower or even negative economic growth in some years and a higher debt burden. Because effectively in that scenario, a greater amount of value is leaking out of the system, if you will, realistically to countries like the United States or Israel. The core point here is that defence spending is never free, governments have competing priorities, and if you're going to be building up your military and military-industrial potential, that cost has to come from somewhere. But how this additional investment is targeted will go a long way to determining whether Europe just gets additional military equipment and capacity out of this, or if they also end up boosting their industrial and research sectors in the process. Whether this is used to build up an industrial base that can better compete on a global scale, potentially even generate more exports and economic growth in the process, or is instead used to paper over existing issues. And I think politically, there's also both a risk and opportunity here. Despite the somewhat strained economic situation in Europe, there's generally stronger support for greater defence spending right now than we've seen in many previous years. It's also the case that, based on the surveys I've seen, support for the European Union taking a more active role in creating a common defence and security policy among its member states is overwhelmingly popular, and indeed more popular than the European Union itself, suggesting there might be some survey respondents out there that aren't thrilled the European Union exists, but figure that if it does, it may as well at least try and get defence right. All of this creates a degree of trust and political mandate. If people perceive that money is being spent effectively, that militaries are modernising and expanding, that new jobs are being created, that industry is expanding, and that strategic risks and dangers are decreasing as a result, that kind of public support might sustain itself. But if all they get is story after story of procurement disasters, money being set on fire, or delay after delay after delay, that trust and mandate might start to fade away. In which case, what might otherwise be an opportunity for the Allies to seize the strategic moment might instead turn into a very expensive wasted opportunity. For the US too, from a strategic and political perspective, I think there are both risks and opportunities here, depending on how all this plays out. With this agreement, the US got just about everything it was asking for. A target that would lift Allied spending in percentage terms to essentially US levels, no requirement to significantly change the US defence budget, especially in the short term, and a 10-year roadmap essentially for the execution of a phenomenon that US presidents have been complaining about at least since the Bush era, what Obama had essentially called the alliance's free rider problem. In strategic terms, the US has long expressed a hope that a better equipped Europe would allow the United States to turn more of its attention elsewhere, which in the 2020s realistically means pivoting more US assets to the Asia Pacific. And while the effects might take years to play out, a better equipped Europe is ultimately what the US asked for at this summit, and what the US got at this summit. Meanwhile, what the European allies got was a US affirmation of its commitment to NATO. Arguably a strategic necessity from their perspective, because even if it is possible for the rest of the allies to replace most of what the US contributes, doing so wouldn't be possible overnight. Even though that might sound like a particularly one-sided trade deal, however, I think there are still risks here for the United States, both in terms of it trying to realise the military benefits in the short term, and then in terms of some of the alliance dynamics in the long term. Militarily, the argument that a more powerful Europe might allow the United States to better pivot to the Asia Pacific is logical to an extent, but it does miss a nuance. For many US military resources that you would expect to be most prized in the Asia Pacific, like high-end interceptors for Navy warships, standoff munitions, bomber flight hours, or the terminal high-altitude air defense system, a lot of the time it hasn't been Europe, Russia, and EUCOM chewing through those resources, it's been the Middle East, with CENTCOM making direct and indirect calls on assets that Indo-PACOM would probably prefer to have in their back pocket. Not a single SM-3, SM-6, or THAAD has been provided to Ukraine, but more than a year's worth of production of THAAD interceptors were recently fired by the Americans in defence of Israel. The US hasn't provided Ukraine with any cruise missiles, but plenty were fired against the Houthis in Yemen. And the American Patriot crews who defended Al Udeid Air Base against the Iranian missile attack were, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, flown in from South Korea and Japan. And ironically enough, a number of the US assets that were recently surged to the Middle East came from US forces stationed in Europe. So essentially, even if the security environment in Europe changes, as long as the United States remains committed to the Middle East, there's going to be a limit on how much focus the US military can place on the Asia Pacific, and also what assets it can afford to pull away from EUCOM and CENTCOM, because America's presence in Europe often ends up underpinning its options or operations in the Middle East. Another potential risk has less to do with what we just saw happen, but why it happened. In the process of getting this agreement that goes well beyond what we've seen in the past, the US also deployed leverage in a way that went well beyond what we've seen in the past. We saw direct or indirect allusions to various potential carrots and sticks, with a particular focus on the sticks. Spain, for example, was threatened with tariffs over its stance on defence spending, and before an agreement was reached, Trump made a comment there are, quote, numerous definitions of Article 5, end quote. The Trump administration essentially demonstrated its willingness to use the different geopolitical pressure points available to it, from trade to military commitments, in order to get the outcome it wanted on the security chessboard. And the response, very publicly from many of the allies, came through loud and clear. They flattered, they smiled, there was the whole daddy thing, and they agreed. NATO's Secretary-General essentially credited Trump publicly with making the agreement possible. The Dutch royals invited him to stay a night in a palace, and on his return to the US, the White House lent into the whole thing, posting the words, quote, daddy's home, end quote, along with a video with a similarly named Usher soundtrack. These were not the optics of conventional international diplomacy, and they were very much one-sided, in part because I'd argue the US had a lot of leverage in these negotiations and chose to apply it. The non-US NATO allies do have significant military resources, and they are in the midst of a rearmament effort. But especially with the way that NATO has been designed to operate, they'd be in a very difficult position if the US decided to withdraw tomorrow. To be capable of more independent operations, they need time. We've seen Europe able to scale up military production to meet more and more of Ukraine's requirements. But as we've just seen from the fallout of the suspension of some US military aid shipments to Ukraine, they're not in a short-term position to replace everything. And as long as questions around security and NATO remained open, there was also the potential of them being used as leverage in other negotiating areas, like on trade, which is an incredibly significant negotiating process covering the largest trading relationship in the world, that between the US and the EU. One potential risk then from Washington's perspective in the longer term is that as a very general rule, whether you're talking about business or geopolitics, if you repeatedly apply leverage in order to try and turn the screws on someone, you also give them a strong incentive to try and remove or counterbalance that leverage. And with respect to security policy specifically, what that could potentially mean is the other NATO allies deciding to give the United States basically exactly what it's asking for. In investment and capability terms, the previous relationship between Washington and the rest of the NATO allies was unbalanced. But you could argue the dependency it created in some ways worked in the US's favour. The allies could afford to spend less on their own defence, for example, but a lot of what they did spend would go to purchasing American systems. Purchases of American hardware took up a significant chunk of European military procurements. And in Canada, the Prime Minister stated that, quote, 75 cents of every Canadian dollar on capital spending for defence goes to the United States, end quote. Essentially, the Allies accepted the US was the primary guarantor of the alliance structures, but in exchange accepted American leadership of those structures, American soft power, and proved to be regular, reliable supporters of America's defence industrial base. If these new spending targets are carried through, however, we should expect to see that relationship change. With greater strategic independence, more capacity for the European allies to defend themselves and deter against Russia and other potential threats without that same reliance on American capabilities, and a lot more focus on channeling more of this increased demand into European and allied defence sectors. Given the shortages of so many different sorts of systems and inputs on the market right now, and the status of the American incumbents, seeing that scale up in Europe and elsewhere, and the diversification away from reliance on US imports, might take some time to play out. But if we do start to see it, for example through joint European programs or the ramp up in artillery ammunition production, or word that Germany might be working on a massive procurement for potentially thousands of armoured vehicles, it would be evidence that we might see a change in the dynamics of NATO in the future, where the US ends up with more militarily capable allies who are less reliant on the US coming in with the steel chair if anything starts to go wrong, but also allies who might be much more independent and harder to influence. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic evolves as spending levels start to come up and we progress into the 2030s. In summary then, I think it's fair to say that in many ways the agreement we just saw doesn't match the headlines. The increase from 2% to 5% was more of a jump from 2 to 3.5%, with a new category being created, counting a bunch of additional investment to get to the magic 5 number. The target bound everyone, but there was an exception, and the Allies accepted the importance of moving quickly, but also set themselves a 10-year time limit. In those respects, the Hague Declaration may not have matched all of the hype, but in another respect, it represented a very real agreement that confirmed an ongoing trend. European military investment is lifting and lifting quickly. Several nations have already reached the new target, or say they expect to reach it well before the 10-year deadline. How much all that spending achieves will likely come down to the details, what governments choose to spend it on, and how efficiently they're able to do it. The peace dividend may be gone, along with any remaining optimism over at the Russian central bank, but whether or not these new targets ultimately prove to be transformative or mostly symbolic, only time and a healthy dose of procurement strategy will tell. And so I can lead off the channel update by saying that in a couple of weeks we'll probably come back to this topic to discuss both how a rearmament program on this scale could potentially be gotten right, and the many, many, many ways that historically countries have found ways to get things like this wrong. I'm hoping that episode can be a bit more lighthearted given the density of economic concepts involved, but I also wanted to make sure that it wasn't rushed, hence the decision to break it off into its own episode. In terms of broader channel updates, by the time this one goes live, there should be an update over on Patreon covering a little bit of what you should expect to be coming up on the channel, as well as what's going on with the secondary channel, Brewing Gaming. And then based on the feedback and polling to that one, I might have a few more updates here next week. In the interim, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and barring any major dramatic shifts in global events, I hope to see you all again next week.